Hi, I'm Cindy Gustafson, and I'm Chair of the Placer County Board of Supervisors. Today, joining me is Sheriff Wayne Wu and our Cal Fire and Placer County Fire Chief, Bryan Estes. And we're here today to talk a bit about one of the biggest concerns that I hear from constituents since I've taken office, and that is wildfire and wildfire evacuation. It is a common fear that our residents have, and they have many questions on it at many public meetings. So with that, I wanted to have this opportunity to share the incredible training and preparedness both our Sheriff's Office and our Fire Department do to make sure that we're there to protect you and get you safely out of your homes and to protect your homes wherever possible. So with that, I wanted to start with a question for Chief Estes. Could you explain how you worked with the Sheriff's Office in Unified Command to identify the early evacuation routes of the Mosquito Fire?
Yeah, thank you, Supervisor. The Mosquito Fire, now that we're 20 days plus past the initial start of the Mosquito Fire, where it's at right now today at about 90% contained and roughly 76,000 acres. And I go back to the initial days starting on the evening of September 6th and not really embracing a situation where we had to form a relationship on the scene of the incident, but where we honed a craft that we've been working on for years and years and years. And that's the element of being in unified command and having a unified decision-making process between the Sheriff's Office and Cal Fire and County Fire. And when we look at what today sits as the perimeter of the Mosquito Fire, and just to kind of remind people and take us back to the evening of September 6th at about 6 o'clock in the evening. The fire started, as we all know, down here in Oxbow Reservoir, and it burned under some really extreme conditions, remembering that we were on the end of about 7 days of record-setting heat and low humidities. And the fire was burning in extremely steep terrain. People may remember there was some thundercell activity that came over the fire that evening and caused the fire to expand in a couple of different directions. Really what we saw that first 24 to 48 hours was the impact to Forest Hill and specifically that evening to Michigan Bluff. And over the next 7 days or so, we saw the impact to Forest Hill, Todd Valley, Michigan Bluff, and then as everyone knows, the fire did jump into El Dorado County and affect the communities of Volcanoville, Quintet, and Georgetown. But what I will tell you about our initial actions between the Sheriff's Office and the Fire Department is right from the very start at the ICP or Incident Command Post there in Forest Hill, we entered into Unified Command. And what Unified Command really means is that both of our agencies are bringing resources and jurisdictional responsibility and money to the table. And with that, we have a unified decision-making process with the Fire Department having the operational oversight of where the fire is going and our priorities and objectives, and of course the Sheriff's Office having the jurisdictional responsibility for evacuations. And to not be in a unified command situation and literally standing as close as the Sheriff and I are now, our fire ground commanders were through the middle of the night, that night, making those combined decisions. And I think as we saw those zones initially form that Sheriff will talk about, those were absolutely done in concert with the operational priorities of the fire. And where we saw the fire move and where we saw the fire have its biggest threat and its biggest impact to our communities, being that life and property are always our highest concern and number one priority, that's where we made those decisions. And not being in unified command and not having the trust and relationship between two agencies, we just couldn't complete that.
Thanks, Chief. I really appreciate that update on how you work together. And then Sheriff Wu, can you explain the difference between warnings and orders and when those were triggered in this situation?
Sure. So evacuation orders are when we think that there's an immediate threat to life. And that is a lawful order for people to evacuate. We make those decisions, like the chief said, in unified command with their operational experts, with their fire behavior experts, and that's when we make an evacuation order, when we feel like there is an immediate threat to life. The warnings are that there's a potential threat to maybe life and property, or there's other residents that might take longer to evacuate, people that have livestock, pets, things like that, or other people can start preparing. That's when we put the warnings in place that depending on fire behavior and how things escalate, that could eventually move to being an order to evacuate that area.
So there's always a few who try to stay behind, and we hear those stories. Sometimes they end tragically. Thankfully, in this event, that didn't occur. But why do you think it's so important that people follow those orders?
Well, first of all, just for their own safety, fire behavior, as the chief will, I'm sure, testify to, has changed in the state of California, and we've seen that play out tragically in other communities. Fortunately for us, I think we've been proactive as the fire department with the sheriff's office and Placer County in trying to get a public service announcement out, making people aware of Placer Alert. We had probably in my career some of the biggest compliance rate for evacuations. I think we were up at over 98%, almost 99% compliance. We had almost 6,000 residents evacuate this area, this impacted area, and we had 90 confirmed residents actually stay behind. So the level of cooperation from the citizens was like I hadn't seen in my career. And it's really imperative because it frees our staff up for so they can do other things like patrol the areas, and it really clears out the area so the fire department can get in and do the critical work that they need to do to save homes and work on structure protection and actually fight this fire. I can't thank the community enough for their cooperation and level of cooperation, the number of people that evacuated during this incident.
And they did it in a timely manner. It seemed like it was pretty orderly. We didn't hear about huge backups and traffic jams, even with those very narrow roads, and really being one way in, primarily one way in and one way out.
Yeah, I think a lot of that goes back to what the chief mentioned earlier, being in unified command, the fact that as a young sergeant, for me 20 years ago, the sheriff's office and Cal Fire partnered in yearly training for just these types of incidents. Not only to practice the technical competencies of the job that both of us have to perform, but also it's that relationship building, being able to know a friendly face, have worked on scenarios and worked on incidents just like this in tabletop exercises to marry up at the scene and immediately start making those decisions and have that trust was critical to our success. We kind of operated in two main phases of the evacuation. During the initial stages, it was more the Michigan Bluff, Forest Hill area, and I'm very happy to say we evacuated those areas in about 2 hours. And then as the fire progressed a day or so later, we ended up having to evacuate Todd Valley, and we were able to accomplish that in right around 4-ish hours, which I think is a testament to not only the pre-planning efforts we've had, but also the community's cooperation.
And those roads are narrow, and there are people that are back ways up in the woods, and sometimes they feel they're going to get forgotten. But I know our sheriffs know where our residents live, and our firefighters know where they are. So.
Yeah, you know, some of those, we have more time on our hands, some of that is in the planning process with some of the ingress, egress, and how long it might take to evacuate and when we're going to trigger that mandatory evacuation. And then we also utilize Placer Alert. Our high-low sirens were put into effect. We utilize social media, and then, of course, like you mentioned, all of our deputies are going door to door as well.
Yeah, that's great, because I think often the public thinks, will they know where I am? How will I know to get out? And I think it worked well. We didn't hear of anyone not understanding when they needed to go and that they needed to go when they did. And I reflect back on the river fire as well, where it was a much faster moving fire right up into the community and into the residences. And your whole team did such an incredible job, both of you, getting everybody out on that fire as well. Chief Estes, how do firefighters determine which homes to try to save?
That's a fairly common question, and I think there's sometimes a misperception that we're going to look at certain houses as, or certain residential structures as, unsavable, or that we use some sort of triage system. And the very fact of the matter is that we are here for the protection of life and property. And we will put our people into harm's way in order to effect that service to life and property. What I will tell you, though, is that we really have to make some operational and strategic decisions when it comes to protecting someone's property and ensuring that we have a fighting chance to save that property. There are a number of ways that residential structures are destroyed in a fire. Sometimes it's when the main fire front comes through, but not always. Oftentimes it's after a fire front has moved through and the resources are diverted to life safety issues in front of the fire, and then embers can get caught in eaves or in gutters or underneath a wood pile and ignite the home or residential structure at a later point. So that's where it's so critical that people engage in home hardening and defensible space, and just some really, fairly simple tenets of being responsible for your property and being accountable for the fact that we all live and recreate and reside in an area that has the greatest impact really to us is from a potentially damaging wildfire. So we're always going to go in and we're always going to make an effort at every single residential structure, but we just need that defense so that we can try to provide that offense.
When people are evacuating, is there something they should do to help the firefighters? Is there anything that they can do in that situation as they're leaving their home?
Sure. I think the number one most critical priority for us to tell people is just to get out early. Oftentimes you'll see people that will stay, whether it be to try to take care of animals or try to secure a building, or maybe they think, it's not quite there yet, I'll make a stand, and then they end up leaving at the last minute. That's only going to create hazards both from the life safety standpoint, but create issues for our partners when it comes to road closures and egress out of some of those narrow roadways you were speaking of earlier. So if there was one single thing I would ask people to do is when the sheriff's office issues that evacuation order, that's time to get out. The preventative measures of being prepared to evacuate early, those need to happen way earlier in the year. We're so aggressive, and frankly, Placer County is so good about, our citizens are so good about being prepared. And most of our folks that live in these fire-prone areas, they know it, they live it, they understand it, and they are prepared early on. And so when we do issue that order, my request is that they just try to get out as early as possible so we can get emergency equipment in to affect life and property.
Great. And one other question. I heard later that a lot of people left hoses on or sprinklers on trying to assist in protecting their property. Yeah. Is that advisable?
Not really, because oftentimes in rural settings you either have a limited water supply that's a municipality, as in the case of Forest Hill Public Utility District, or you have wells. And those wells are often affected by electricity going out. So really it's better if you have storage tanks, water storage tanks, make sure that you have a fire department connection on those tanks. If you have a swimming pool, part of what we do when we do that assessment or triage is we look for those viable water sources at a residence. But to just leave something on thinking that it's going to wet the area down or wet a roof down really is not going to do as much as just securing that water supply for the professionals.
Great, thank you. And Sheriff Wu, did you have any issues with the narrow roads and trying to get people out while firefighters and emergency equipment were coming in?
We didn't in this case. I think, like I said, to evacuate an area the size of Todd Valley in roughly 4 hours, I think is a testament to a lot of the pre-planning. And we've heard this in Forest Hill for many years. We've been concerned about it as a sheriff's office. We've created all hazard maps and done numerous evacuation exercises with our staff and supervisors for just this incident. And I think all that training and preparation really came into play during this incident. And being able to have the great communication with the fire department and their fire behavior experts on knowing when we needed to make that notification to Todd Valley to give them adequate time to get out, I think was also critical.
Great, thank you. And then Chief Estes, on September 12th, there was a lot of pressure on the sheriffs and county officials to let people back in. And maybe you want to recount what happened there and why the decision that had been made in Unified Command was the right decision.
Yeah, it's a great point, and you know, I remember vividly speaking to you at the Board of Supervisors that morning in chambers about the successes that we had seen up to that point. We were roughly 6 days into the fire, and through some amazing firefighting efforts, we had roughly secured the perimeter lines around Forest Hill to the north along Forest Hill Road all the way up to Baker Ranch. But the problem is that we had the fire meeting at the Middle Fork of the American in 2 different locations. And that's always an issue when they're not lined up in a river canyon as treacherous and steep as that topography is in there. And as we know, the fire did jump over into El Dorado County days before. So while we did feel very secure about our lines here in Forest Hill, we knew that there was still a potential for some activity down at the river. And the sheriff's office was getting a lot of pressure. We were getting a lot of pressure. And the sheriff's office, one of the first things that they do is ask us about that repopulation. As soon as they have people evacuated, we start working on that process to try to restore normality back to that community. But we just had to be really, really prepared. And so that afternoon, it did jump back across into Placer County and made a really, really aggressive run toward Forest Hill. There was a couple things that were really important to mark about that afternoon. One was we had a much stronger wind event, which we were able to forecast and predict a little bit than what we thought was going to be there. And the other thing was at that exact same time, we had a fire start in Dutch Flat. And that fire also was burning at a critical rate of spread in heavy bug-killed timber toward the communities of Alta and Dutch Flat. And so we had to prioritize the fire up by Dutch Flat in order to make sure we didn't have 2 big fires, understanding that this was going to make a hard run at Forest Hill. Our fire officers had built upwards of 7 or 8 different sets of contingency lines, opening up old dozer lines from the Trailhead fire and previous incidents. So we knew we had some good contingency lines in here. Once this fire was contained up here at Dutch Flat at 50 acres, we diverted all the aviation resources. And I will tell you that that was a record in my career for the number of aircraft over Forest Hill that afternoon. We had 16 fixed-wing air tankers working in Forest Hill and every heavy jet air tanker in the western United States protecting this community. So much to a point that our air attack officer and aerial supervision folks in the air said, we have too much aircraft up here. There was just not enough airspace for them to operate safely. I stood at Wharton's with our field commanders, and I didn't see more than 3 or 4 minutes pass at any given time where an air tanker was not dropping retardant in the protection of Forest Hill and Todd Valley. So I'm really proud to say that you know, working with our partners with the Sheriff's Office, they were able to facilitate a second set of evacuations. We did not lose a single residential structure in Forest Hill that afternoon, and we held it on Forest Hill Road, which was a critical objective. But it just proves the point that while we understand the pressure and we understand wanting to establish that normality, we have to make sure that we never pay for real estate twice. We don't want to put people back in their homes and then have to re-evacuate them. That's not fair to our partners with the Sheriff's Office.
Thanks, Chief. I appreciate that. And what a tremendous effort that was. I mean, it was incredible to watch and hear and feel the amount of equipment in the air to protect Forest Hill. Sheriff Wu, what do your deputies do? Once people are evacuated, they're afraid. They're afraid people are going to loot their homes or take things of value. What are your sheriffs doing in those situations once the communities are evacuated?
So we obviously take it very seriously anytime we have to displace our residents. We understand what a traumatic event something like this can be to them, and we want to make sure they're not victimized twice. At some points during this incident, we had over 120 law enforcement officers from around the region just in the Forest Hill, Todd Valley area. So once the area is evacuated, we shut it down with hard road closures using our allied agency partners like California Highway Patrol help us with some of the road closures. And then we scatter strategically placed deputies and other police officers 24 hours a day throughout the community doing random patrols, fixed post patrols and guard duty assignments throughout the duration of the incident to make sure that nobody else is victimized any further than they already are in a situation like this.
It was incredible to be out there. I got to go out and watch and see how much communication was going on and how everybody was looking out for the properties and the well-being of those that were still there who hadn't evacuated as well. Is there any advice you would give to people as they are brought back to their homes after the evacuation orders are lifted?
Honestly, when we make an evacuation order, the repopulation planning almost for us starts immediately and working with fire and how we're going to make this happen in an orderly manner. But they need to understand that they could still be going into an area where there's some hazards, whether it's air quality, their utilities have been turned off and what impacts that might have on their house and getting things fired back up. And also if they lost property, even if it's an outbuilding, to make sure they work with the resource center and all the other services offered by the county, as they start to try to return to some sense of normalcy and recover from this event.
Thank you so much. And now that we're in the mop-up stage and thankfully we're moving forward and being done with this event, are there any last reflections you'd like to offer to the public?
Well, from the fire department standpoint, we certainly could not do it without, number one, our most valued partner in the county, and that's the sheriff's office. But we also couldn't do it without our local fire districts and people that come together to support that initial attack effort. And, so for Forest Hill Fire Protection District and all our allied partners, I want to extend a heartfelt thanks. But most importantly, really to the community members in Forest Hill and Todd Valley and Michigan Bluff, who, as the sheriff said, with only 90 people really that decided to stay. I think the facilitation of evacuations was outstanding. I think the cooperation from the public and just the resiliency of people who live on the Forest Hill Divide and their understanding that living with the threat of large damaging fires is a part of their life. And listening to us, asking questions, letting us have transparent communication with them and be honest with them, and being patient with us, I think was something I would like to reflect and thank the public for.
And Sheriff Wu, any closing comments?
As I look at this and reflect back again, it's 20 years of preparation. I think we've all known Forest Hill is kind of a critical area. Obviously, when we live in these rural communities, ingress, egress is always going to be an issue with the threat of wildland fires. But we've done a lot of training and preparation. We've built the relationships with Cal Fire, and to see it all come to fruition, I couldn't be more proud of the men and women of the Sheriff's Office, but our partners at Cal Fire on how we navigated through this event. But like the chief said, more importantly, I want to thank the community of Forest Hill and all the residents that cooperated. To have that 98.5% cooperation rate of evacuation is extremely high. That goes to show the trust the community has, I think, in us and the fire service. We don't take that for granted. And for the old timers in Forest Hill that were up there in the mid-90s, they might remember me as I was a resident deputy up there for a while when I was a deputy sheriff, and I know what an amazing, resilient community Forest Hill is, and they will recover from this event and bounce back in no time. I'm confident of that.
Absolutely, they certainly are. Well, on behalf of all of our residents, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to explain it in more detail, and also the incredible dedication and professionalism your crews use to save not only lives but properties throughout Forest Hill. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.